Hey guys, what's up? So, at long last, I am finally getting on with the sword review that I was promising that I would get done. Sword review for this unique little piece here. Another offering from LK Chen. The guys who are making some rather interesting and fairly accurate, actually probably the most accurate reproductions of old dynasty Chinese swords. I got this way back last year. Not way back, but during the fall of last year. I promised to be able to review it after I got some decent cutting footage. And when the weather finally brightened up somewhat, I was able to do that. So I can finally get on with this here. This is a rather interesting piece. I got quite a few things to say about it. It's definitely one of the more unique of the offerings from LK Chen. And it's got a few interesting features that I think it might interest a certain collector or a certain practitioner. For those of you who have no clue who the company is, if you hadn't seen my earlier videos, LK Chen is a company that I was, sort of accidentally and, luckily introduced to after I made a video a long way back talking about Handian and whether they are good for a practitioner of Chinese swordsmanship or not. A contact from the company let me know that most of the weapons that are calling themselves Handian are actually not really good representations of the weapons that were used during the Han Dynasty, and that there were actual weapons being made by a particular company that are much more accurate to the look, weight, feel, and length of those particular weapons. And that's how I got introduced to the company. They are pretty much focused, at least at the beginning, they were really focused on coming up with accurate representations of swords, melee weapons from that particular time period, the Han Dynasty period and the Chu Kingdom period of China. Lately, however, they seem to be expanding outward a bit. Like at first, they were focusing mostly on Jian, or straight swords, Chinese straight swords, double-edged swords. But now they're starting to expand outwards on Dao, or the single-edged swords, and they seem to be, at least from what I've heard, if I remember correctly, they do plan sooner or later to start moving kind of up the timeline, like start going to making representations of weapons from later dynasties. Which, if they are doing that, that would be cool, because I would love to see sooner or later their accurate representation of a Ming and Qing style sword, because considering their focus on their weapons being accurate to the time period, I think it would finally, once and for all, end the debate on what these weapons should be weighed and how they should feel. But that's a subject for a completely different time. Another quick, brief history lesson before we get on with this. The Jian, or the straight sword, was the first sword used, on the battlefield in China. And during the Han Dynasty, it is said that the, use of steel, manufacturing steel, and the making of their straight swords had reached a very high level. Some, in fact, even claiming that that was pretty much the peak of, manufacturing straight swords, manufacturing Jian, and that it's been sort of downhill ever since. Like there's been ups and downs in the quality of their weapons, but there are a lot of people who maintain that the Han Dynasty was pretty much when that was like the peak of that particular weapon, which makes sense when you consider that the Dao ended up it did end up supplanting the Jian on the battlefield at the very least. The civilians continued, civilian populations continued to use the Jian for personal self-defense, as well as a, sort of a status symbol. Nobility tended to carry one, scholars tended to carry one. There's a lot of status and a lot of symbolism behind the weapon. But the Dao became the main one, and this is actually a reproduction of the earliest version of the Dao. Most people, when they hear that term, and they're not equating it to Taoism, they know it as the single-edged sword. Some people call it a broadsword, some people call it a scimitar or a saber. I tend to call it a saber because it's more accurate. At least we're going to try to come up with a term to kind of link it to a more Western design. But yeah, before they were curved, they were straight. And this actually is a reproduction of one of them. If you look at the title, you know that this is their Royal Armory Infantry Hundo, because this was apparently the weapon that was being used by foot soldiers, by the infantry, along with a shield, of course. And what I find interesting about this, now we're going to actually get on with this weapon, this, you know, how small it is. When you consider how long the Den were, especially, you know, the ones that, the offerings that LK China put out, and when you look at the other antiques from that time period and the writings said about those swords during that time period, those swords were quite long. Like, if we look at a quote-unquote typical, excuse me for a second, I went off camera. If we're going to look at a typical design like this one, the Flying Phoenix, which is supposed to be a typical representation of what a foot soldier would carry or what a swordsman would carry, that would be like typical length, weight, design, you can see that one is substantially longer than the other. We're talking pieces with blades around 34 inches in length, if not longer. And we've seen, like, they can be as long, one-handed swords from that time period could be pushed as long as 36 inches, which is insane. No, not really insane. This just sounds insane to me, considering what I've seen of Chinese weapons lately, but yeah, it can be kind of mind-boggling. And then you get this, and it's just like, wait, what? Why did, you know, it get so short? But I'm assuming that this is more for closer ranged use, and considering the Ge was their longer ranged weapon, it sort of makes sense, you know, to kind of give the, you know, infantry, you give them a long pole arm type weapon, and then when they have to fall back to, you know, hand to hand, or when they get into closer range, you got this piece here. And I do have to say, this particular piece looks like we'll get into, you know, its handling, but yeah, close range, this thing is great. The looks of the sword are quite nice, as you can see. We got your typical, I believe they said it was bronze fittings. I mean, I thought it was brass, but my contact had insisted that this was actually bronze. The fittings are utilitarian, but in their understatedness, there's still a kind of gracefulness to it. The end cap here, I really like the design of that. There's solid pieces. Sword hanger here is also a nice solid piece. You got the collar of the scabbard there as well. Nice lacquer on the scabbard, not too much, not too little, just a nice, good protective coat. The blade itself, again, pretty short. You know, again, a tiny little blade. You're going to be surprised. Like, again, just, this is definitely a short sword, you know, by every means of the word. Like those who practice Japanese martial arts would probably look at this like a straight wakizashi or something. It gives me that sort of feel, to be honest with you. On the website, the standard length given for these is about 61 centimeters. Though mine, I'm thinking, was a pre-production copy, because I actually got mine, like this sample was sent to me before they actually offered it on the website. So I get the sense that this was a pre-production model, like it was, you know, kind of like a testing model or something. Not to ding it for that. It's still quite solidly made for the most part. But I do notice that mine is a difference in variation on length, which honestly is to kind of be expected with a lot of handmade pieces. You know, even production pieces, there are going to be variations in length and weight and so on. But mine ended up being about, the blade at least, from the handguard all the way up, mine ended up being 59 centimeters long. Not that big a deal. It's only a difference of 2 centimeters, really. The weight, again, is extremely light. This is quite possibly, you know what, not even possibly, this is the lightest sword that I've handled from the company. And in fact, it is the lightest sword that I've ever held, period. And I'm speaking in terms of a real sword, not some wall hanger somewhere made out of aluminum or something like, or those like freaking wushu steel things that, you know, we don't speak about those here. But yeah, this is the lightest sword that I've handled. It's ridiculous. This thing, at least on the website, is listed as weighing 600 grams. Or, for those of you who, haven't joined the civilized world, 1 pound, 5 ounces. That's crazy. And mine's even lighter than that. When I weighed mine, it ended up being at 508 grams. Or 1 pound, 2 ounces. Yeah. So you're going to think with something this light, and yeah, this thing is light. Like, it feels like nothing. I thought the other swords I've handled from LKChen before were really light. Like, oh my god, it feels like a feather. It feels like no. Oh, no, this got them all beat. Obviously, because it's shorter, yes, it's got less mass, but the Hanjen back then were known to be heavier than the Den. That's why they were designed this way in the first place. They're single-edged swords with a thick spine in the back to help facilitate with the cut, give that extra mass in the cut. And yet, for all that, you don't feel it. I mean, you really have to, like, tip the blade forward like that to start feeling that mass. And even then, it's not a strain on the wrist at all. Like, it's just enough to let you know, okay, yes, I can cut with it. But it's not making you think, I'm going to hack someone's head off. Like, that's not the feel. You don't get a hack someone's head off feel with this. You get more of a, I'm just going to slice and dice feel with this. Like, it's just enough so that you know when you hit, it's going to do damage, but it's still small and nimble and quick and light enough so that you can cut here, cut here, cut here. Like, you're going to go nuts with this. I can only imagine just how fearsome this must have been up close against someone, especially when you were protecting yourself with a shield at the same time. You're just having that. And this thing must have went everywhere at once. This thing must have been employed really fast. Let's talk about the sword itself. Excuse the I really like the hand wrap work here. Up close you can see, a really interesting hand weave. Again, you get that one single cord going through, but it's interwoven between strands, and it's very tight. Very, very tight. I, was cutting with this, handling this, moving around with this like crazy since the time I've got my hands on it, and this stuff has not moved at all, not a millimeter. It's very, very tight, very nicely woven. And I just happen to like the design of it. The pattern of it also just looks really nice. You got the simple little ring down there, which again was, used in a utilitarian way. Plus it's also traditional to have the ring at the end of knives. And this one, it's good, solid steel. I believe that this is a mix of two steels. Again, like pretty much all the swords offered by LKChen. It's the same steel that they usually use, which is a mix of T65 carbon steel and T8 tungsten cobalt vanadium steel. The T8 is apparently a tool steel, supposed to be, really good for, hard steel and tools and things like that. And 1065 is just a steel that is used like crazy throughout, the sword manufacturing industry for a good reason. It's just a really good all-around great steel for, giving a good edge, making it, resilient for shock. Like, it's just a good steel to work with. And the pattern is obviously folded steel, and LKChen have pretty much sold me on patterned steel swords that can be used like everyday use, like cutting use or whatever. Before I was I was stringent on, if you're going to be using a sword for like constant practice and for cutting, real swords anyway, you want to go mono steel. Because usually folded steel, they historically and even nowadays, they tend to take sets if you cut with them wrong. After a while, that nice polish that's usually on the blade where you can see that nice little wood grain pattern or whatever pattern you might have on your blade, sooner or later it's gonna get scuffed up, scratched up, whatever. It's just not gonna look as pretty, and you want to be able to see that beautiful pattern. And so far with the LKChen swords, they've held up. They've not taken sets. The polish holds up. The edge, oh my god, the edge. Not only are these the lightest swords I've handled, and, as far as overall quality, some of the more impressive ones, but they're also the sharpest swords I've handled. And this one's no exception. This thing's got a hell of an edge. Really, slicing paper with this was almost effortless, and cutting through targets, as you'll see later, was also fairly effortless. I say fairly effortless because we do have to remember the weight. Even though the point of balance on this particular piece has been pushed forward a bit, which it kind of has to be for a weapon this light. Granted, it's not so forward so much that it feels clumsy, but it is about 15 centimeters from the handguard, or almost just under 6 inches from the handguard. So it's, you know, for something like, that's usually what you would expect for a longer blade. And for such a shorter blade, you're going to think that that would be cumbersome. Not for this. It feels just right. So you know you're going to be able to get through your target. But even so, you really have to have some good technique to be able to cut through targets with such a light weapon as this, because since you don't have as much mass, the technique and the skill is going to have to make up for it. As well, of course, as the edge. But again, if your edge alignment is wrong, or you don't really not like proper follow through, you know, with the weapon, you're going to have a hard time with something like this if you're doing cutting practice. So one other thing that may not be apparent at first, as far as the design of the blade goes, is there is a slight, very slight inverse curve going on here, which I find interesting, because usually when it comes to dull or other saber type weapons, you tend to have a curve, you know, kind of going outward that goes with the flow of your cut. It goes with the arc of your swing. This one, however, has a slight inverse curve, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I don't know whether it was because they were first learning how to temper something like this. But I have noticed that when tempering a single-edged blade, depending on how you did it, if you didn't do your differential hardening, if you didn't do your differential hardening correctly, you may end up getting it to curve the other way. And like, indeed, you do sometimes see, like I've seen, who hasn't seen a lot of videos on people making Japanese swords, you know, katana, where after they do the clay treatment and they do that final quenching and they throw it in there, you actually see the blade curve inward toward the edge first a little bit before it then goes back the other way. And considering that this does not have a hamon on it, I can't help but wonder if that might have been what was going on with this. Like, they obviously still wanted the sword to be straight. I mean, think about it. If you got an army, a group of trained fighters who are used to using straight weapons, and then you're switching up their melee weapon all of a sudden to something like this, you're going to want something similar to what they used before. You don't want to have to spend too much time retraining them on a whole new weapon. So at least keep the straightness of the sword as you're fighting with it. I'm thinking that probably maybe it's an artifact of them trying to keep it straight, that it might have been in there. Or it could just simply be, you know, I might be overthinking this, and it could just simply be that they wanted it designed that way. You know, to have an almost, a very almost, because again, that inverse curve is very slight, but it might go with that kind of almost a sickle sword type of effect, where you can kind of like almost go toward the head, and then it helps with the slice motion as you're cutting with it. Possibly. I really, you know, I should contact my contact who knows a lot. He knows a lot about this historically, and he could probably steer me straight on that. But yeah, it's just to let you know, this is a long-winded thing of letting you know that there's a very, very, very slight inverse curve there. And that's something that is very easily, you know, missed with a weapon like this. Even the longer ones apparently are like that as well. So yeah, beautiful looking blade, holds up to a lot. You know, pretty much well made for the most part. We'll get into that in a bit. Hand wrap is nice, scabbard's nice. It's going for a fantastic price, I personally think. Like, I believe it's going for $220. That's crazy, considering, you know, how well made this is, how well honed the blade is, you know, how well patterned, you know, how well put together the whole overall package is. $220, absolutely amazing. And that's not even getting into how well it actually cuts. As you can see in this footage here, cuts quite well. So yeah, as you can see, this is the footage that I put up of me pretty much slicing bottles. And I have a mix of both soft ones, like this right here, and hard ones as well, like that one there. Even though that was a really passing cut, it was able to slice through. Every single last one of the cuts I pretty much did here, they all cut clean. Even that one right there, that really hard Arizona bottle, and I actually did that one with a pretty much empty bottle because I did an earlier cut and the water spilled out. And then I made that cut when it was empty, and it just went right through. Again, I have to stress that since this is a light sword, you have to really make sure your edge alignment is good. and you have to make sure that you have good follow-through, because otherwise it's going to be a little hard going through harder targets. But light targets like that one, yeah, it just goes right through them. The edge is just really, really sharp. This here is actually a funny cut. I try to see if I can kind of go through that empty piece. And while it didn't exactly slice all the way through, you're going to notice when I come back that it did cut rather deeply into the bottle. Like, you see I'm showing it right there, and you can, if you look carefully, you can see the flap. Like, it actually cut substantially. And that one was another pretty easy cut. Big jug bottle. I'm convinced that this could go through tatami or newspaper. It's just that I didn't have that with me to properly show it off. One of these days I should, but I will say that I am quite confident that this could pull that off, just from the way this was able to slice through these. Like, I barely even felt the cuts. Like that one too. That was a particularly hard bottle, and that went through like it wasn't even there. So, yeah, with, you know, how well it cuts, how well it feels in the hand, how well it handles, how well put together it is, $220? That's a steal, right? There couldn't possibly, like, there's got to be a catch, right? Doesn't seem to be a catch. This is a steal. This is probably one of the better weapons to get your hands on. And even, like, one could argue, if you really wanted to, considering the small, you know, form factor of the blade, it might even be like kind of like a personal self-defense weapon if you are so inclined to do that, though I wouldn't recommend it right now in the United States, depending on where you live. But, I mean, you certainly could. I mean, it's small enough to carry with you and or keep in your car or something. I mean, what could possibly be wrong with something this beautiful, this well made? Well, I'll show you. Yeah. Before I continue on, I will say that this next part could be considered to be a bit subjective. And by that I mean that for its price point, some people may consider these fittings falling off to not be that big a deal. $220, usually you get pure garbage at that price point. Well, not so much anymore. There's some companies that tend to sell swords at around that price point anyway, and their swords are, you know, pretty much decent pieces. I'm thinking of like Chines, for instance. They sell katana at around that price point. Musashi sells swords around that price point, and even though they're, you know, they're on the cheaper end of the spectrum, and there's certain things that are, you know, certain trade-offs that you're going to have to consider, like plain fittings, not as good quality with the wood or the blades or whatever, certain steps skipped, you know, they're more or less known for to be good companies. And LK Chen themselves, they are a fairly young company. They only just came out last year, as far as I know. They might be a little older than that, but as far as I know, they're a pretty young company. And, you know, these are the sorts of things that can be ironed out, and I've talked about it before. And I've heard that, you know, a lot of the swords that are coming out now don't really have, you know, really a whole lot of quality, you know, quality control issues. And I've had a couple of people privately message me and tell me that because of my reviews, they've picked up the sword and they really, really liked it and they had no problems with it. And I personally am hoping that the pieces coming out are made as well as they possibly could and they're not suffering from issues like this. But if I'm going to be honest, if I'm reviewing it, I have to be honest. And again, this is me. I like the company. I really want LK Chen to succeed. But this is the reason why I'm pointing out things like this, because, and at least I can't be the only one that would be disappointed in something like this, even at the $220 price point. And also, because there's a certain passion that I've noticed with this company. They really want to be like the best, but like the number one shop for somebody wanting a reproduction of actual weapons used during an historical time period. They don't want to come up with cheap knockoffs. They don't want to come up with what they consider to be contemporary fantasy swords. They want their swords to, you know, properly represent what was used during that time period, and they want their weapons to reflect the pride in their particular country's martial history and martial arts. So it's because of that passion that I feel I can't let stuff like this slide, because stuff like this dings that image that you're trying to portray, even at a low price point. Now, I'm not exactly sure what caused this. It seems to me that whatever glue or epoxy they used, either they didn't use enough of it, or it wasn't strong enough to hold on to for a long period of time. It could also, again, be just climate issues. Again, the climate and temperature over in China is different from over here in the States, and things like this can happen that aren't necessarily the manufacturer's fault, just simply from being transported from one country to another. You know, and then of course there's the whole problems with shipping, knocking things around, things getting loose. I understand that, but that wasn't really the case here. This came to me pretty well packaged. You guys saw my unpacking video. And this fell off within the first couple of days of me receiving it. And the handguard fell off after one particularly hard cut that I made on a particularly hard bottle. So it's the glue. Now, granted, everything else, this, tight as hell. The handle, no cracking, nothing getting loose. It's still a solid piece. But stuff like this, I know will turn some people off. Maybe not everyone. Again, I am pretty sure someone in the comment section is telling me that I'm nitpicking too much. It's $220. Just get some freaking glue and glue it back on yourself. And besides, historically, swords tended to get loose and needed maintenance all the time. Shut up. You're perfectly valid for saying that. Me personally, this sort of thing annoys me. Is it enough for me to say this is a garbage sword? No. It's still mostly well made. The blade definitely holds up. It's sharp as hell. It cuts pretty well. The steel is really good. The most of the craftsmanship, like the hand wrapping and the overall quality of this, really great. And also, I do need to stress, and I should have mentioned this earlier, we also need to keep in mind, and I also need to keep in mind, which is the reason why I'm not completely saying this sword is garbage, because it's definitely not. Everything you see on this particular sword, everything, is made for this sword. And the same goes for all of the LK Chen pieces. Now, what I mean by that is, usually when you're getting swords from a Chinese company or a Chinese forge, even the good ones, generally, a lot of the swords are pretty much assembly piece swords, which you're going to be like, duh, they're production pieces. But what I mean by that is, there's a market in China for not just selling swords, but for making swords. And by that I mean that things like handguards, scabbards, fittings, handles, all these sorts of things, and whether they're Chinese swords or Japanese swords or what have you, they're all being manufactured somewhere. And then you got these forges that they primarily are concerned with just making the blades, and when they're selling their swords, they'll just grab some fittings off the shelf, like, yeah, this pretty much matches, and slaps that on and sends it on your way. In fact, a lot of those companies that are, selling what they call custom swords, where you can pick and choose what blades you want with what fittings, the reason why they can do that is because they got a whole bunch of them on the shelf that they ordered from another factory somewhere. And this is not to say that, that means that those swords are garbage. I'm just saying that that's the nature of the business. So you may, if you ever wonder why, like this guy from this company got, a decent sword, and then the same one from the same company, they ordered different parts and they didn't seem to fit right. That's why. That's not the case with LK Chen's swords. With that company, and I've actually seen, evidence of this, everything is made for that sword. So that means this blade was fitted to this scabbard. Like this scabbard was made around this blade, and the handle and this piece, everything was made for it. Like these things were made together as one unit. That's, in my opinion, awesome. It's rare, especially again for this price point. All the LK Chen pieces, for that matter, were like that. And there's sometimes some evidence of it, like the early pieces I've seen, you'd see a little bit of the wood glue on the blade because they kind of made it around that. But yeah, that's the reason why. And it's, again, that dedication to making really good pieces and being willing to put that much effort into making sure each one of the swords that they put out are as good as possible. That's the reason why stuff like this can be a bit upsetting, and why I'm pointing it out. Like, if you're going to be putting that much work into pumping out pieces like this, then there should also be at least as much the same level of attention to making sure that these things don't just simply fall off by looking at them. Get some better glue, or I mean, if it's a temperature thing, if it's a climate thing, then there's very little that can be done. But if it's really, honestly, it just seems to be more of the quality of the glue or the amount that's being used on it could be better. But overall, I still say it's a really good sword. I certainly am happy to have it. And I think a lot of other people who are looking for a nice little short, unique piece, I think they'd be happy with it as well. Just keep in mind the quality control issues with, certain fittings. I will say, though, that most of the people contacted me about the gen that they've ordered from LK Chen. They've had no complaints. And again, keep in mind that mine was a pre-production copy. So these kinks most likely had been ironed out, but again, I just have to speak on what I found when I was reviewing this, when I was working with it. So yeah, that's the review for this sword. I personally like it. I think some other people would like it too, as I already said before. I personally can't wait to try out their cavalry Hondo, which is much longer than this one. I actually owned an earlier, way earlier version that was heavy as hell. It looks like their newer version is nowhere near as heavy as that one, and it's a lot more manageable to use. But the main reason why I'm interested is this, like within moments of me handling this little piece and looking at it, I had this image in my head of this weapon being an offhand weapon. I know it was used in conjunction with a shield. It was a main melee weapon, like after your long-handed weapon was gone. But I can't help but think, how cool would it be to see a Chinese take? And there have been, believe it or not. But I would love to see somebody with this as an offhand weapon, and either a longer Dian, or better yet, that cavalry Hondo as the main weapon and two-swording it. I'm not saying it's historically correct, though. There are throughout certain time periods, there have been two-handed use. I'm not getting into that right now, but I'm just saying that would be awesome. I would love to see somebody's take on that. Like, a shorter Hondo in one hand, longer Hondo on the other. I'm geeking out just thinking about that. So, when I get some cash together, I'm planning on getting that piece, and then reviewing that one. And I also am interested in the Sui Dynasty Hondo as well. I'm not so sure if I'm going to pick that one up, but I am interested in it. So who knows? I might probably pick that one up as well down the line. But this is I like what LK Chen's doing so far. I think if they, again, I said this before, but I think if they keep up with their passion, keep up with the amount of quality that they want to put in these swords at the price point that they're putting them at, and they really work hard to make sure the quality control issues are ironed out completely, they're going to go far. I personally think. So, yeah. That's all I got to say about that one. Hope you guys liked the review. I'm sorry it went on a bit over long, but yeah. That's all I got to say about it. Catch you guys later.